The deafening pulse of electronic music and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes suddenly fell dead silent. The ocean breeze sweeping across the upper deck of the luxury yacht, a vessel that legally belonged to my company, suddenly felt suffocatingly still. My son-in-law, Julian, stepped into the center of the crowd. He was wearing a tailored Italian linen suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. Beside him stood my daughter, Sarah. A smug, predatory smile rested on Julian's lips, the smile of a man who believed he had finally conquered his final obstacle. He held up a rusted, salt-corroded diving gauge, an old piece of junk he had likely pulled from the scrapyard down by the docks. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, Julian tossed the rusted gauge onto the polished teak deck right at my feet. The heavy metal hit the wood with a harsh, ugly clatter that echoed through the silence of the 50 elite guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian announced, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "Please don't mind the old man. This is Frank. He's a bit of a charity case. He used to scavenge for scrap metal at the bottom of the harbor before his ears popped and his brain slowed down. Now, we just let him live on one of the old barges out of pity." He looked down at me, his eyes filled with malicious triumph. "Pick it up, Frank. That's about all you're good for these days. And while you're at it, fetch me another gin and tonic. The help seems to be slacking tonight." A wave of uncomfortable whispers rippled through the wealthy crowd. I didn't look at the guests. I looked at Sarah. My daughter turned her face away, staring out at the dark waters of the Atlantic. She did not say a word. She did not defend her father. I looked down at my hands, the thick, white scars crisscrossing. My knuckles were souvenirs from 30 years of deep-sea salvage diving, cutting through jagged steel hulls of sunken freighters in the freezing, pitch-black depths of the ocean. I had sacrificed my hearing, my youth, and my body to the crushing pressure of the sea. I had built deep-water salvage and logistics into the largest maritime recovery empire on the eastern seaboard, all so Sarah could attend Ivy League schools and never know the biting chill of poverty. And this was my return on investment: silence, while an arrogant boy in a linen suit humiliated me in front of the city's elite. I didn't argue, I didn't shout. In the deep ocean, panic kills you faster than oxygen deprivation. You learn to control your heart rate, to move deliberately, to preserve your energy for the ascent. I bent down, my knees popping from decades of nitrogen absorption, and picked up the rusted gauge with both hands. I held it for a moment, feeling the cold, dead metal. Tonight I would swallow this humiliation whole. I stood up, slipped the gauge into the pocket of my worn canvas jacket, and turned my back on Julian. I walked down the gangway and stepped off the yacht without a single word. "Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, make yourself comfortable, and remember that the people in these stories always had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose otherwise." Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. I walked down the concrete pier, the salt spray misting against my weathered face. Behind me, the music on the yacht flared back to life, accompanied by the muffled sound of Julian's triumphant laughter. He was deeply satisfied. He thought he had just publicly broken an outdated, washed-up old diver. He thought his 5-year campaign to marginalize me was complete. I climbed into the cab of my battered 1998 Ford F-250. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, drowning out the bass from the yacht party. I sat in the cab, the smell of marine grease and old coffee washing over me, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Julian didn't know one crucial detail. He thought I was a relic living in a rusted houseboat because I was destitute. He didn't realize I lived there because it gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of the shipping lanes and the deep-water salvage dry docks. I had spent the last 5 years stepping into the shadows, handing him the executive chair to see what kind of captain he would be when a storm hit. Tonight, he hadn't just failed the test, he had declared mutiny, and his place on that yacht, in my daughter's life, and in my company, was about to sink to the bottom of the ocean. I shifted the truck into gear and drove away from the marina. I didn't cry. Men forged in the pressure of the deep sea don't cry over humiliation. We calculate, We prepare the charges, we detonate. I parked beside the old converted tugboat I called home. The air was cold, thick with the smell of low tide and diesel fuel. I walked inside the small cabin, the floor swaying gently with the harbor chop. I sat down at my cramped desk and turned on a single dim brass lamp. On the desk sat an old tarnished brass diving compass. It was the only keepsake I had left from my late wife, Martha. We had found it together on our first salvage dive 35 years ago. Looking at it, the memories flooded back like a breached bulkhead. I remembered the bone-chilling winters repairing underwater pipelines in zero visibility. I remembered the time a rusted crane cable snapped, nearly severing my arm, and I stitched it up myself on the deck because we couldn't afford the downtime. Every drop of blood, every sleepless night was for Sarah. And now she stood on a multi-million-dollar yacht, watching her husband treat me like a stray dog. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a secure, encrypted satellite phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. The ringing tone echoed through the quiet cabin. I needed an exact answer from the only person who held the architectural blueprint of my empire. The person on the other end answered on the second ring. "Frank," the voice said. It was Evelyn Vance, the most ruthless corporate attorney on the Eastern Seaboard. She had been my legal counsel since deepwater salvage was just 2 guys and a rented skiff. Evelyn never slept, especially when the scent of blood was in the water. "Evelyn," I said, my voice as rough and cold as a rusted anchor chain. "It's time to surface. I need you to pull the master incorporation files and the executive authorization agreements for deepwater salvage." The sound of a keyboard clattering rapidly came through the speaker. The silence lasted for 2 agonizing minutes. Then Evelyn chuckled, a dark, dangerous sound. "Julian is a spectacular fool, Frank," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave. "He's been operating under the assumption that the management authorization you signed 5 years ago gave him permanent executive control. He thinks he owns the fleet, and the reality?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The reality," Evelyn replied sharply, "is that you and Martha established an irrevocable founder's clause. The management authorization is temporary and conditional. It becomes immediately null and void the moment the acting CEO engages in actions that damage the founder's reputation or the integrity of the company assets. Julian doesn't own a single bolt on those ships. He's a temporary tenant, and you hold the eviction notice." I could feel the pressure in my chest equalizing. The humiliation from the yacht party was instantly transformed into cold, calculated strength. "Prepare the legal torpedoes, Evelyn," I said. "We file them the moment the federal courthouse opens tomorrow morning. I am taking back the helm, and I'm going to show Julian the crushing pressure of the deep." I didn't try to sleep that night. Sleep is impossible when the water is rising in the lower decks. I stepped out of the houseboat and walked along the deserted commercial pier. The fog was rolling in thick off the Atlantic, illuminated by the harsh sodium vapor lamps of the shipyard. I walked for 2 miles until I reached Warehouse 7, an old, corrugated steel structure that Julian had dismissed as abandoned scrap storage. I unlocked the heavy padlock and slid the door open. Inside, covered by a tarp, was the genesis of my empire, a rusted 30-foot salvage skiff named Martha's Grace. It was the first boat my wife and I had ever owned. I sat on the gunwale of the old skiff, the scent of dried salt and aging wood filling the air, and let the ghosts of the past surround me. Martha had died of aggressive lung cancer when Sarah was only 12 years old. The medical bills had threatened to bankrupt us, but Martha made me promise one thing on her deathbed, that Sarah would never have to worry about money. She made me promise that our daughter would have a life built on solid ground, far away from the dangerous, unpredictable depths of the ocean. I kept that promise with brutal, unrelenting labor. 2 years after Martha died, I took a high-risk contract to recover a sunken oil rig platform in the Gulf of Mexico. During the dive, a structural collapse pinned me under 3 tons of twisted steel at a depth of 200 feet. I was trapped in the freezing darkness for 6 hours, breathing a highly toxic mix of compressed gas, while my crew frantically worked to cut me out. I survived, but the rapid, uncontrolled ascent permanently ruptured my eardrums and left me with a severe limp that ached every time the barometric pressure dropped. Every scar on my body was a down payment on Sarah's future. I sent her to the finest boarding schools and paid cash for her Ivy League tuition. I wanted her to be surrounded by the best, to be safe. But in my obsession to protect her from physical danger, I failed to protect her from the predators that wear tailored suits and drink vintage champagne. Julian had introduced himself to Sarah at a charity gala I had sponsored. He presented himself as a passionate marine conservationist, a man dedicated to saving the oceans. It was all a meticulously crafted lie. He recognized a wealthy heiress with an absent, blue-collar father, and he deployed a charm offensive that isolated Sarah from her roots. Over 5 years, he systematically brainwashed her into viewing me not as the man who bled for her, but as an embarrassing, uneducated relic of a bygone era. He had succeeded in turning my daughter against me. But tonight, he had crossed a fatal line. By threatening the integrity of the company Martha and I built, he had awoken the apex predator of the harbor. I spent the next 3 hours in the warehouse, meticulously reviewing the fail-safes and security overrides for the entire deepwater salvage fleet. I was preparing a tactical strike, and I intended to leave absolutely no survivors. I ended the call. The brass clock on the bulkhead read exactly 2 a.m. I stood up, put my heavy, salt-stained canvas jacket back on, and stepped out into the freezing harbor darkness. I knew exactly what I had to do next. A mutiny cannot be negotiated. It must be crushed before the sun rises. At exactly 5 a.m., the harbor was enveloped in a thick gray coastal fog. I stood in front of the massive iron gates of the deepwater salvage central dry docks. The icy Atlantic wind slipped through the seams of my jacket, but I didn't feel the cold. I punched my master override code into the electronic security panel. My rough, calloused fingers tapped each command with absolute precision. The old access codes were purged from the mainframe. A new cryptographic lockout protocol was established. The system emitted a sharp, electronic chirp, and the massive iron gates slammed shut, the heavy magnetic locks engaging with a thunderous clank. From that moment on, Julian's kingdom had been sealed from the outside. At exactly 8:30 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes S-Class glided through the fog and parked beside my rusted Ford. The tinted window lowered smoothly. Evelyn Vance sat in the back seat, holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio stamped with the red seal of the Federal District Court. I opened the door and climbed inside. The cabin smelled of rich leather and expensive espresso, a jarring contrast to the scent of marine diesel clinging to my clothes. I sat silently, my eyes fixed on the entrance to the dry docks. 10 minutes later, Julian arrived. He drove up in a gleaming Porsche 911, loud European house music thumping from the speakers. He stopped in front of the main gate, rolled down his window with an arrogant flick of his wrist, and entered his familiar access code into the keypad. A red light flashed, an error buzzer sounded. Julian frowned. He punched the numbers in again. Harder. This time, another red light. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel, killed the engine, and climbed out of the car, his face flushed with irritation. He thought it was a simple technical glitch. He had no idea he was standing in the crosshairs of a silent torpedo. He pulled out his phone, preparing to scream at the facility manager, but Evelyn moved first. She opened the door of the Mercedes and stepped out with the commanding presence of a battlefield general. I followed behind her, my heavy steel-toed boots striking the wet asphalt with undeniable authority. Julian saw me. A sneer of absolute disgust crossed his face. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to hurl the same insults he had used on the yacht, but Evelyn didn't give him the chance. She raised the federal court order directly in front of his face. He saw the red seal. The arrogant smile vanished instantly. "Julian," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the morning fog like a scalpel. "Deepwater Salvage and Logistics has officially suspended all of your management authority. Full executive control has been immediately restored to the founder. You are trespassing on private property." Julian stammered, taking a step back, but Evelyn wasn't finished. Her expression darkened, and she pulled a second, thinner, document from her portfolio. "During an emergency forensic audit initiated at 3 a.m., Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, We reviewed the maritime manifests for Triton Exports, a shell company you incorporated 3 years ago. We discovered a $2 million discrepancy in salvage recovery logging. I looked down at the incorporation documents for Triton Exports that Evelyn handed me. My vision blurred. The air in my lungs suddenly felt as heavy as lead. The signature on the primary registration line, right next to Julian's, belonged to Sarah, my daughter, my own flesh and blood. The elegant cursive handwriting I had paid private tutors to perfect had been weaponized to bleed my company dry. But it wasn't just embezzlement. Evelyn had discovered the true nature of Triton Exports. Julian wasn't just stealing money. He was using deep-water salvage vessels to illegally recover and smuggle protected maritime antiquities and unrefined rare earth minerals off the coast, bypassing federal customs entirely. He was running a multi-million-dollar international smuggling ring, and he had used my daughter as his legal shield. Everything around me seemed to freeze. The salt spray blowing off the harbor felt like needles against my skin. Betrayal from an enemy makes you angry. Betrayal from your own blood leaves you hollow. Julian saw the devastation in my eyes, and his false confidence surged back. He took a step forward, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit, a slimy, triumphant smirk returning to his face. "You think you've won, old man?" Julian whispered, leaning close so Evelyn couldn't hear. "If you take this to the authorities, if you make this public, Sarah goes down with me." She signed the incorporation papers. She authorized the manifests. "You turn me in, and you personally send your only daughter to a federal penitentiary for maritime smuggling." He thought he had found my ultimate weakness. He believed that paternal love would force me to surrender my empire to protect her. He understood absolutely nothing about men who make their living in the deep ocean. "We are protective, yes, but we do not negotiate with pirates. We do not accept corruption." I didn't say a single word to him. My silence was as heavy and crushing as the Mariana Trench. I turned my back on Julian without giving him another second of my attention, and walked directly toward the main administrative office overlooking the dry docks. Evelyn walked silently beside me. She knew I needed quiet to process the darkest decision of my life. I sat down in the worn leather chair behind the massive oak desk in the founder's office. The document bearing Sarah's signature lay before me. I looked at the old brass diving compass sitting on the corner of the desk, thinking of my late wife. I had given Sarah everything, except the discipline and accountability she desperately needed. Today I had a choice: protect a guilty child and watch the company I built become a criminal syndicate, or detonate the charges myself and save the honor of deepwater salvage. I picked up the heavy desk phone. My hand wasn't shaking. It was as steady as it was when I operated underwater welding torches at crushing depths. I dialed the extension for the harbor master's radio room. "Mac," I said, speaking to the grizzled old marine engineer who had been my first mate 30 years ago. "Gather all the veteran dive crews in the main fabrication warehouse at noon. Nobody leaves the yard. This fight isn't just mine anymore. It's about protecting the name painted on the side of our ships." At exactly noon, the heavy blast horn echoed across the harbor. I walked down to the massive fabrication warehouse, where the smell of welding ozone and cutting torches hung heavy in the air. Over 20 veteran divers, marine engineers, and crane operators were waiting. These were men and women whose faces were deeply lined by the sun and the sea. They didn't ask questions. They had already heard the rumors echoing down the docks. Mac stepped forward. He didn't waste time with a corporate speech. He put a massive, calloused hand on my shoulder and gave a firm, singular nod. It was the absolute loyalty of a brotherhood forged in the crushing depths of the ocean. "We don't work for the suit, Frank," Mac said, his voice rumbling like a diesel engine. "We work for you. If you give the order, not a single ship leaves this harbor under his name." A young diver stepped forward and handed me a heavy, encrypted hard drive. "We pulled the real sonar logs and GPS coordinates from the salvage vessels, boss. The ones Julian tried to scrub from the mainframe. He's been meeting unmarked freighters 12 miles offshore." The betrayal from Julian and Sarah had opened a bleeding wound in my chest, but the unshakable loyalty of these blue-collar maritime workers was the tourniquet that stopped the bleeding. I wasn't hollow anymore. My heart was filled with the cold, crushing pressure of absolute resolve. Justice for a deep-sea diver isn't found in begging or negotiating. It's found in surfacing the truth, no matter how ugly it is. I took the hard drive and returned to the main office. Evelyn was already waiting, flanked by 2 armed federal marshals she had quietly contacted earlier that morning. We issued an emergency corporate summons for Julian, ordering him to appear in my office at exactly 3 p.m. for a final negotiation. I knew Julian wouldn't surrender easily. He was a manipulative parasite. He would try to use Sarah as a human shield to force a stalemate. But he didn't know that I had prepared a final, devastating trap beneath the floorboards. At exactly 2:55 p.m., the sharp sound of Italian leather shoes echoed down the wooden hallway. Julian walked into the office, his arrogant smirk firmly back in place, looking completely unfazed by the morning's lockout. He tossed a manila folder onto my desk, right beside my late wife's brass diving compass. "Let's drop the theatrics, Frank," Julian said, leaning over the desk with a condescending sigh. "You're old, you're tired, and you're out of your depth. I'm willing to overlook this little stunt. Sign over the remaining equity of Deepwater Salvage to me, and I'll make sure you have a comfortable allowance for the rest of your pathetic life on that houseboat." He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a venomous hiss. "But if you don't sign, I will trigger a medical competency hearing. Sarah will testify under oath that your mind is gone, that you're suffering from deep water dementia. And if you try to bring up the smuggling operation, I will hand the feds documents proving Sarah orchestrated the entire thing. She'll do 10 years in federal prison while I walk away clean. Your move, old man." I sat in my chair, my hands resting on the polished oak. I wasn't angry. My silence was as cold and absolute as the ocean floor. Julian mistook that silence for defeat. "You have absolutely no idea what you're dealing with, Frank," Julian sneered, pacing in front of the desk like a conqueror, claim a conquered territory. "You spent 30 years pulling rusted propellers and sunken barges out of the mud for pennies. I modernized this operation. I took your obsolete fleet and turned it into an international, untraceable logistics network." He leaned closer, his eyes burning with arrogant pride. "The antiquities I've been recovering from the wrecks off the Carolina coast. The federal government claims they belong in museums. But private collectors in Dubai and Macau are willing to pay tens of millions for a piece of unregulated history. And the rare earth minerals. We bypass customs completely. We use your old, established shipping routes, your impeccable safety rating, and your trusted name to move the cargo right under the Coast Guard's nose." Julian laughed, a sharp grating sound. "The best part? You built the reputation that gave me the cover I needed. But now, you're a liability. Your old-school morality is archaic. It's pathetic. If you don't sign over the equity today, I won't just initiate the competency hearing. I will systematically dismantle Deepwater Salvage. I'll sell the dry docks to a commercial real estate developer. I'll sell the ships for scrap metal. I will erase your name, and Martha's name, from this harbor so completely that in 5 years, no one will even remember you existed." He slammed his hand on the desk, right next to the brass compass. "Sign the paper. Frank, give up, or watch me burn your entire legacy to the ground and take your daughter down with it." He thought he was securing his victory. He didn't realize that my hand was resting beneath the edge of the desk, depressing the transmission button on a high-frequency marine VHF radio. I wasn't just recording him. I was broadcasting his confession live on an open federal channel directly to the United States Coast Guard cutter and the FBI tactical unit waiting just past the harbor breakwater. Evelyn, standing quietly in the corner, finally smiled. She tapped her earpiece. "Transmission confirmed, Commander." Julian frowned, confusion breaking through his arrogance. "Transmission? What are you talking about?" "Threatening a competency hearing for financial extortion is elder abuse, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And confessing to international maritime smuggling on a federal radio frequency is simply suicidal." The color completely drained from Julian's face. He lunged toward the desk. But the 2 federal marshals stepped out from the adjoining room, their weapons drawn. "Julian Vance," the lead marshal barked. You are under arrest for international maritime smuggling, extortion, and corporate fraud. At that exact moment, the wail of police sirens and the deep, blaring horn of a Coast Guard cutter shattered the silence of the harbor. Red and blue tactical lights flashed violently through the office windows, illuminating Julian's terrified, pale face. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room with absolute finality. The arrogant boy in the linen suit was gone. He stumbled out of the office, his head hanging in total defeat, destined for a federal penitentiary, where his tailored suits and expensive watches would mean absolutely nothing. I walked to the window and looked down at the harbor. Sarah was standing near a squad car in the rain, steel handcuffs gleaming on her wrists. She looked up at my office window, her face stained with tears, her eyes wide with fear and profound regret. I didn't go down to her. For a father, watching a child be led away in handcuffs is a pain that eclipses any physical injury. But for a captain, justice must be applied evenly to the entire crew. By 6 p.m., the storm had rolled in. I stood alone by the dry docks, the heavy rain washing the grease and salt from the concrete. Julian was facing 20 years, Sarah facing federal civil charges, her life among the elite permanently destroyed. I was about to walk back to my houseboat when a yellow taxi pulled through the main gates and stopped in the pouring rain. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out. She wore no raincoat, her expensive clothes immediately soaked by the freezing coastal storm. After posting bail, she hadn't gone to her luxury penthouse. She had come straight to the docks. She walked toward me, her designer shoes splashing through the oily puddles. I didn't step out of the rain. I let the freezing water run down my face, looking at her with the empty eyes of a man who had survived a catastrophic shipwreck. Sarah stopped 3 feet away and dropped to her knees on the cold, wet concrete. The hands that had signed away my company now clung desperately to the hem of my heavy canvas jacket. "I'm sorry, Dad," she sobbed, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "He lied to me. He promised we were building something bigger. I was so stupid. I want to come home. I want to learn this business the right way, even if I have to scrape barnacles off the hulls." My heart clamped down like a steel vise. I looked at the daughter I had sacrificed my body to raise. I thought of my late wife, Martha, and how she used to bring soup to the docks during the winter storms. The anger in my chest softened, but the discipline of a deep-sea diver remained. Betrayal is a rust that takes years to grind away. I reached down and pulled her to her feet. I didn't hug her. I looked her directly in the eyes. "Tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., I said, my voice harsh and unforgiving, completely devoid of the coddling she was used to. "You report to Mac in the fabrication warehouse. You'll wear heavy canvas overalls and steel-toed boots. You won't be managing spreadsheets, and you won't be sitting in a climate-controlled office. You are going to learn how to operate an angle grinder. You are going to learn how to run a welding torch until your arms shake from exhaustion. You are going to scrape the barnacles with undeniable, absolute with undeniable, with undeniable, with undeniable, with undeniable, absolute clarity. Absolute clarity, absolute clarity, absolute clarity, clarity, off the hulls of the ships you tried to steal. You will eat lunch with the crew. You will take orders from men who have spent 30 years building this company, and you will earn back every single dollar you helped steal with your own bleeding, calloused hands. If you are late by even 1 minute, I will personally throw your gear into the harbor and ban you from these docks forever." Sarah didn't argue, she didn't flinch. For the first time in 5 years, the entitled heiress was gone, replaced by a broken young woman, desperate for redemption. She nodded silently, wiping the freezing rainwater and tears from her face, accepting the brutal terms of her salvation. I turned and walked away, heading back toward my small houseboat. When I stepped inside, the cabin felt quiet, steady and secure. The brass diving compass sat perfectly in the center of the desk, gleaming in the dim light. A sailor's pride is not something that can be sold or stolen. Life may throw its most cruel storms directly into your face, just as Julian threw that rusted gauge at my feet. But your response dictates whether you sink or swim. Never kneel before a mutiny, even when it is led by those you love most. Secure the bulkheads, build your strength, and let justice be delivered with the crushing force of the ocean. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until the end of this story. Join our community by liking and subscribing to see more powerful, dramatic family-centered stories. Until next time, keep your air tanks full and never let them see you drown.